David Jolly, Rick Nolan. Two politicians. Jolly, Republican from Florida. Nolan, Democrat from Minnesota. What do these two have in common? They both said in a 2016 interview with 60 Minutes that they are advised by their own parties to spend 30 hours a week on the phone with donors. But for me, it felt appropriate because, as you'll soon see, the American departure from democracy is profound, and the problem lies deeply within the system itself. But let me not get ahead of myself. Let's just take our time and dissect what I'm talking about. Who actually influences American democracy? That's a question I want you to keep in mind as we go through this episode and unveil new evidence. Is it the voters or the people and institutions capable of financing the political system itself? Before going further, it's important to briefly explain how campaign fundraising actually works in American politics. Running for office in the United States is extremely expensive. Campaigns require money for advertisements, staff, travel, polling, media outreach, events, and increasingly digital campaigning. Because of this, politicians spend enormous amounts of time fundraising in order to remain electorally competitive. As I mentioned earlier with David Jolly and Rick Nolan, these men, or these politicians, spent 30 hours a week, a day and a quarter. More than 1/7 of the week they spent on the phone with their donors. You see, it's because politicians have to spend enormous amounts of time fundraising just to remain electorally competitive. And I want to make this very clear now before any false assumptions are made about future content that is talked about in this episode. Legally, politicians cannot pocket money that they receive from donations for their campaign. That is for the explicit use of campaign-related things and cannot be extracted for private usage. Let me just say that clearly now, because I think that can be a common misconception maybe. But I don't want to say either that, no politician has ever done that. I'm just saying that it's legally not possible. But that's not how the incentive, or that money isn't the real incentive anyway when it comes to donations. You see, with donations comes this electoral competitiveness that I was speaking of, and this allows politicians to maintain political power, preserve donor relationships, which can be beneficial after their career in politics. As you may know, many go on to be advisors and get a boatload of money and salary after they're done with their political career, working for major U.S. companies and companies abroad even, and advising them on political matters. And these relationships that lead to such jobs, for example, are built exactly in this time period when they are on the phones. Well, I don't want to say begging, but, fundraising. This fundraising though, has its consequences. These donations, contributions, they come with expectations. Because I'll remind you that these are typically large institutions, corporations, or wealthy individuals. And especially in the case of corporations, what you have is a singular goal of profit maximization. And a company or a profitable company will never invest money into something without expecting a return on investment. So the politician is expected to generate a return on investment, ROI. And how can a politician do that? Well, I'd like to introduce you to a study by Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page. Link in the description. Basically, they examined who actually influences public policy in America. Their findings became deeply controversial. The study concluded that economic elites and organized interest groups appear to have substantially more influence over policy outcomes than average citizens. Now, this doesn't mean that ordinary voters have no influence, but it does suggest influence is not distributed equally. And obviously, in a true democracy, every man, every woman, every person would be equal before the law. In this case, as we currently are situated, there's a clear bias towards wealthy corporations, individuals, and institutions. And I want to clarify this. The study showed or suggested that these corporations and institutions, individuals, they aren't directly purchasing legislation. And I want to make that clear. That's often not how politicians are producing the return on investment for these entities. Rather, it's minute details that the average person doesn't have the interest in researching, or doesn't have the time to research, or maybe doesn't even know how to find the information. It's subtle things. For example, this is a fictional example to clarify. Let's say a mining company contributes $350,000 to a senator who happens to be on an oversight committee of mining, mining practices whatever. And it just so happens that this mining company, is in fact using illegal practices or whatever. Even delaying the investigation into this mining company, even if the politician were able to bring about that by, let's say, 3 months. Well, in those 3 months, that company, fictionally speaking, could make $4 million. Now, that's a good return on investment. Whereas if you didn't contribute to this politician, you'd be in a situation where you might be facing a fine, and a big one at that. But although that return on investment is huge, the methodology, simply pushing out that investigation, is actually quite obscure, especially for the public to follow. Is not impossible, but it's very unlikely that someone is so politically in tune and frankly cares. We'll get into this later, but a big aspect in all of this is that the voter base isn't particularly keen on checking to make sure that their elected representatives are, doing what they're supposed to be doing once they reach office. Another way that politicians can, produce return on investment for these corporations, for these entities, is that they can publicly, support the industry, for example, or even the company itself. Maybe they can hand out, especially on committees, can hand out contracts to individual companies, and of course, they can vote certain ways that would favor these companies. But ultimately, it's all about access. These donors have considerably more access to our politicians than we do. And that's a problem. Because I'll remind you that oftentimes, by the way, let's not forget this either, these entities often come from out of state. They're not even remotely close to, geographically remotely close to the, for example, the senator that they are contributing to. And that is absurd to me, because the constituents from, the senator's home state, they are being neglected in turn for who knows, maybe a corporation from, let's say you have a senator from Iowa, and, who knows, maybe a corporation from Texas is like contributing like 30% of his total campaign finances. This corporation, trust me, is more important to that politician than his constituents. And that is problematic. I'm sure you're aware. But is it the politician's fault? Well, we'll talk about that more at the end. But I think this system, this competitiveness that is required to stay electorally viable, this need for money, when you have opportunities to secure large amounts of money, I think the politicians are somewhat forced to take these. And when you have them so compressed, these contributions, when you have them so compressed into 5, 4, maybe 6, individual donors that are generating like 45, 50% of your entire fundraising, then we have a severe dependency on these 4 or 5 individuals. Basically, from a politician's perspective, we cannot let these donors not donate to us. Because if they aren't donating to us, they are donating to our competition. And on top of that, we ourselves are losing the necessary funds to keep on, running in Senate or Congress, whatever. So you see this dependency that I'm trying to show, this dynamic of dependency that isn't given to the average voter, because the average voter is maybe what the singular average voter might be producing 0.01% of the total campaign financing. So that person is not relevant. proportionally to and it really can be ultra high net worth individuals sometimes who are making these contributions, and that individual is proportionately more important than the average person. And keep in mind, like I said, this individual can easily be from a completely different state. And that's wild. That is something that we don't need to get emotional, but we can objectively say that there is something that is fundamentally gone wrong there. And we can confidently say that campaign donations influence the behavior of politicians. And for years, evidence was mixed. But I want to highlight for a moment a recent paper from a man named Alberto Parmigiani. I hope I'm saying that correctly. From the London School of Economics and Political Science. His paper is titled Campaign Contributions and Legislative Behavior, Evidence from U.S. Congress. Now, this paper is amazing, and I recommend everyone pause this video, go in the description, find the link, click on it, and read this paper. This paper is sensational. Basically, what Parmigiani did was quantify legislative action based on the distribution of their donations, as in what percentage comes from single large donors and what percentage comes from, average to small size donors. Empirically, Parmigiani was able to show that members of Congress disengage from their legislative responsibilities when they have an unbalanced distribution of contributions. He created a variable which he calls share top 10. And this variable shows the percentage of total campaign financing of a given member of Congress that comes from the top 10% of donors. The share top 10 being referring to the top 10%. 0 would be, well, first of all, it would be theoretically impossible in today's political landscape. 0 would be that a politician, a member of Congress, has 0% of their money coming from the top 10% of donators. 1 would be 100%. So all of their money would be coming from the top 10% of donors. This is also theoretically impossible, as you still have voters who donate to politicians with small monetary values of, for example, just $10. The average for a member of Congress, if you were to randomly select a member of Congress and look at their share top 10 value, you can expect 0.47. That's essentially 50% of their total contributions coming from the top 10% of donors. So let that sink in for a second. Another shocking fact that Mr. Parmigiani discovered was that in this period, in which he gathered his data. The top 100 donors out of more than 4 million in total that donated money in that period, obviously, they contributed 23.4 billion out of 36.7 billion total dollars. So let me rephrase that for you. 0.00025% of all donors were responsible for 63.7% of all donations from a monetary value standpoint. You should let that sink in as well. Parmigiani discovered that essentially the more donations a politician receives of $200 or less, the more politically active they are. For example, in suggesting new legislation. Whereas the higher the percentage of share top 10 is in a member of Congress, the less political actions they take. For example, bill sponsorship, speech making, appearing before congressional hearings, these things. In other words, the things that they're meant to be doing. Let me give you a specific example of a certain politician. Charles Ellis Schumer, better known as Chuck, is a senator from New York. He has served in Congress since 1981. Now, in 1987, Schumer publicly opposed repealing the Glass-Steagall Act, a banking law originally passed during the Great Depression to separate ordinary commercial banking from high-risk investment banking. In 1999, Schumer, who had just entered Senate at that point, up until then he was a representative, voted to repeal Glass-Steagall. What happened in those 12 years that would make Chuck Schumer change his mind so drastically? Well, over time, Wall Street and the securities industry became some of his largest sources of campaign support. According to Open Secrets, a very valuable tool, by the way, link is also in the description, I highly recommend it. In 1990, just 2 years after, or 2.5, 3 years after Chuck Schumer made this, or as a matter of fact, let me clarify, Chuck Schumer didn't just oppose it. He actually wrote an article in the New York Times about it. I also have a link to that article in the description below. Essentially, I mean, to quote him, I quote, "The bank's proposals also defy common sense, period. Given the chance to speculate, some institutions are going to gamble poorly," end quote. I think this is the real Chuck Schumer. But you see, 2 years later, 1990, as I mentioned, according to Open Secrets, he had become the second highest recipient of donations from hedge funds, fifth highest from security brokers and investment companies, sixth highest from investment banking, and seventh highest from private equity and investment firms, as well as credit agencies and finance companies. Now, as I told you, in 1999, he supported the repeal of Glass-Steagall. And I quote, this is also from a New York Times article. There are many reasons for this bill, but first and foremost is to ensure that U.S. financial firms remain competitive. Roughly a decade later, another article from the New York Times appeared. It called Schumer the most deregulation and free market agenda friendly Democrat in all of Congress. He supported measures that can be considered to have led to the 2008 financial crisis, from which, or 2008 is from which this article stems. Link once again in the description. Not only did he help financial institutions avoid billions in taxes and fees, the article also states that Schumer succeeded in limiting efforts to reform and regulate credit rating agencies. Now, in the near 40 years since this original article of Schumer opposing deregulation, the poverty line of his home district, of his constituents, has hovered around 20%. For context, Schumer is from Brooklyn, New York. The national average in that same span has hovered around 13%. That's a 7% discrepancy. Let me definitively articulate what I'm saying. He has betrayed, forgotten, neglected, whatever word you'd like to use, his constituents, and instead has appeased the financial sector and grown complacent with their funding. Now, it may seem like I've gone somewhat hard on Schumer, but to clarify, these are just the facts on his handlings since he has gotten into office. And rest assured, there's another example I have from across the aisle. And I apologize if it felt like I was overly critical of Mr. Schumer. That's not the intention. I just wanted to display and effectively display how drastic the situation really is. In future episodes, I will always try to bring examples from both sides of the aisle, and I will just alternate between who goes first. So coincidentally, this week it was Democrat, next week it will be Republican, so on and so forth. Now let's get to our other example that I have lined up. Mitch McConnell. Senator Mitch McConnell was born halfway into World War II. This man is 84 years old at time of recording. I'm sure you've seen the infamous meme of him freezing whilst holding an interview. McConnell is the longest serving senator from Kentucky of all time. He is also the longest serving Senate party leader in U.S. history. How has he maintained such longevity in politics? The answer is actually pretty simple. Mr. McConnell is effectively the GOAT of fundraising. Basketball has LeBron, football has Brady, and fundraising has Mitch McConnell. In 2020 alone, the super PAC One Nation, which is closely affiliated with the Republican Party and Mitch McConnell, spent nearly $200 million on political ad campaigns and funding the Mitch McConnell-aligned Senate Leadership Fund. Now, to clarify, McConnell himself has only received, and I say only with quotation marks around it, about $145 million for his own campaigns throughout his career. But since 2015, McConnell-aligned outside political groups have raised more than $1 billion for Republican political operations. He's managed to stay in power because of how influential his fundraising network is, not only to himself, but his entire party. McConnell has fought campaign financing regulation his entire career. He has always framed it as free speech, as political speech, political expression that is protected under free speech. In 2003, he was the plaintiff of McConnell versus FEC, a case that sought to deregulate campaign financing, and this case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And although he didn't win the case outright, it did set the groundwork for Citizens United versus FEC. Citizens United versus FEC was a case that also reached the Supreme Court, in which the justices concluded that corporations, unions, and outside groups could spend unlimited amounts of money independently in elections under the First Amendment. McConnell, in no small measure, can be attributed to the rise of fundraising significance in the modern political landscape. Furthermore, and you can look this up yourself on Open Secrets, it is well documented that Mitch McConnell is also a large benefactor of the investment banking and finance sectors when it comes to contributions towards his own campaign. I think neither of these men are truly representing their constituencies as intended. But I want to take a step back because by now you're probably thinking this has been some sort of personal vendetta against these two politicians, and that's simply, I assure you that that is not true. This is merely a real world example for the problems that we have discussed earlier, and this dynamic that I mentioned. Let's take a step back. Let's observe the whole picture. Can we blame politicians for this? In my mind, the answer is clearly no. The solution to this problem, to this defilement of democracy that we are facing, the solution is not to blame the politicians. The politicians almost have their methodology to maintain power pre-prescribed. You know, in a normal democracy, their methodology should be to act in their best interests of their constituents. So why is that? Why are they allowed to get away with it in America? Well, now we're approaching the real problem. the system itself. More precisely, a winner takes all system. You see, the winner takes all system and similar systems to it, they tend to naturally produce two dominant parties. A phenomenon known as Duverger's law. Over time, this creates a political duopoly. Some political scientists argue that systems with multiple major parties and proportional representation may better reflect the diversity of public opinion. A good example would be Germany, where pluralism allows for, at the moment, in the current government, 7 different political parties that all are able to act in the legislative branch. This directly leads to a higher quality of democracy, because although pluralism does feign to be at times inefficient, and extremist parties do arise, like the AfD in Germany, for example. This system, or a system in which pluralism is allowed to flourish, allows the individual citizens to more accurately vote based on what they truly believe in, instead of having to kind of adapt what they actually want to one of the two parties and their current direction, which, by the way, changes every couple of decades. And why is that important? Well, not only is that important for the democratic value of each individual person and their beliefs, it's also important because we can finally move past this cutthroat duopoly that basically has brought in the voter group into a sense of fear, a state of fear that their vote won't matter. That's why, even though, let's say, for example, a Democratic voter is actually more inclined with the Liberal Party, but since the Liberal Party has no realistic chance of winning, this voter chooses to vote for the Democrats instead, because he knows that the party with which he actually, or he or she or they, actually is more inclined with has no chance of winning. And rather than seeing the party he truly wants to see win, rather than to vote for that, he votes against the party he would most like to see lose, if that makes sense. It is the nature of this fierce rivalry itself that allows politicians, especially once they are an incumbent, to get extremely complacent. To put this into perspective, Mitch McConnell served 40 years. He will be leaving Congress finally in January of 2027. And let me remind you, this man chose to retire. He was never beaten. And that's because where he hails from, Kentucky, is primarily or heavily GOP, Republican Party leaning. That fact, coupled with the fact that he has received enormous contributions, made Mitch McConnell essentially unbeatable. Why? Because it didn't matter how he was voting, how many speeches he was holding, if he was appearing before hearings or anything, really. None of what he actually did on Capitol Hill mattered to his constituents. All that mattered was that he was Republican. You see, it's this hatred, I want to call it, or fear of the other side that, blues have for reds and reds have for blues, that has kind of lulled them asleep. Think about it. I tried. There are no concrete facts or statistics that detail how often a person goes their entire life voting for just one party. But I'd venture to guess that it's relatively high. And for them, it's as simple as looking at the ballot, seeing R or D, and checking accordingly. And the character, well, again, I don't want to go into the character of politicians. I think it's human to fall victim to large contributions. So I don't want to judge them on that. But the politicians, they have free reign because the majority of their constituents, they don't really care what they're doing. They just care about whether they're Republican or Democrat, as I said. And that's problematic. A question for you. If political competition is structurally limited and influence is unequally distributed, how representative is this system really? Hardly. And therein lies the failure. Now, we can talk about fundraising all day long, but the crux, the core of the problem is our system, along with the fact that we are allowing corporations to have free reign in politics. And to clarify, let me call a spade a spade. Citizens United versus FCC, respectfully, that was a mistake. To give corporations and other entities the same rights, we'll say, as an ordinary citizen when it comes to political expression is bogus. Corporations have one goal, maybe two: profit maximization and expenditure minimization. What about us individuals? What about the voters? What do we care for? We care for civil rights topics, freedom of speech. We care about religion. We care about infrastructure. We care about all these things. That's what separates us from corporations and other entities like this. That's why we are not equal. And we shouldn't be equal. Corporations should not be equal to individuals. Let me make that clear. In the sense that when it comes to this political expression, because they're not politically active. They don't care. They're only worried about maximizing profit and expenditure and minimizing expenditure, as I just said. And with such a tunnel vision, I think that alone is enough to prove that compared to the average citizen who has and a plethora of political interests, that the intentions of corporations cannot be deemed as worthy of having a right that would allow them to further influence politics itself. But let me make this clear. Companies, corporations should be focusing on profit maximization and expenditure minimization. I'm not anti-capitalist, to make that clear. But I think what we've kind of lost is a feel for where money should matter and where it shouldn't. And this is topics for another day, so we won't get into it now, but I think most would be inclined to agree that money, especially from corporations and other entities, has no place in politics. That would just about conclude our episode for today. Well, one more thing, I guess, relevant to the episode is, I cannot stress this enough. Research what your elected officials are doing, and if they are doing some foul things, blow them up. Let them know about it. Tell your friends to let them know about it. Tell your family to let them know about it. Make sure that they feel pressure, because then it's very likely that they'll start acting accordingly. Because let's not forget this. These corporations and big entities, they're only big when it comes to monetary value. But we have numbers. We decide the politician's fate. Let's not forget that. And let's use that power. If the system is already going to be flawed, then so be it. But let's use that power that we do have, not to threaten, but to pressure our politicians. And this is sad. This is a sad sentence. To pressure our politicians into doing the right thing. Right, now that is like officially the end of the content. I just want to say I apologize for this episode being late. I completely underestimated how much time editing would take and everything like that. Just want to say, if you're here, thank you for listening. Criticism, tips, anything like that, comment section below. I'm always open for those kind of things. And I'll definitely consider it. Yeah, stay aware. Stay aware and be vigilant. And of course, as always. So a little PS, so to speak. This is like 5 minutes after I actually recorded the outro, but I'm thinking that these senators and representatives in like super, Republican or Democrat leaning states or districts are actually probably the ideal targets for these large entities and corporations and their contributions, because if you think about it, once they get there, once they're incumbent in a area or state in which the other side is the minority or overwhelming minority, at that point, this becomes a really stable investment for these corporations and entities, because that figure, that person, that politician will be in office likely for a very long time, especially with your backing. So that's just a thought I had after the outro. I don't know. Another thought I had actually was, I just wanted to clarify that when I'm talking about politicians in this episode, I mentioned that they don't care, or that the constituents don't care about what they do once they're elected. I mean predominantly MCs, members of Congress. Obviously, everybody cares about what Donald Trump does. So I'm not counting the president in any of that. And the Supreme Court either. I know Supreme Court has been pretty controversial last 5 years or so. So what I meant was basically the MCs. Yep. All right. That should be it. See you in the next one. Take it easy.